Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and it's the morning of Friday, 13th July 2018. And I was hoping to be outside this morning, but it is, I won't say chucking it down, but it's pretty miserable. But there's a big sigh of relief up here in the Pennines because the water shortages were starting to take a bite, and a lot of people around here actually get their water from boreholes. The only good news for them is that they are outside of the targeted fracking area in the north of England, but nonetheless, they are still very sensitive to the fact that the licenses actually stop just a few miles away to the northwest from here. Well, the title of this morning's broadcast is "Want to Stop Fracking? Then Prepare to be Sectioned," because as I explained yesterday, the democracy that people still want to believe that we have in this country is nothing more than a charade. The UK is a corporatist state, and basically the corporations have free rein to do whatever they want. So commerce is the absolute precedent for anything in the country. And basically, anybody who is running a business, particularly if that business is sanctioned by central government, then if there is any opposition to that business, then all that corporation has to do is go to a legal firm and engage them to pursue injunctive relief through the courts. And of course, basically, this requires that all those involved effectively put their humanity on hold. They have to completely ignore the potential negative impact of their activities and just focus on the objectives of the corporation. And of course, they are motivated to do that because of, well, in most cases, their greed. In other cases, just because they fear it is the only way in which they can get sufficient financial resources to be able to keep a roof over their head and food on their table. And of course, this is the sad factor of a materialist society, that we have lost the ability to connect with the wider realm. And so for the vast majority of people, and who can blame them, because this is the way they are conditioned right from the get-go, they have to participate in the corporatocracy to be able to survive. So the reality is that those who hang on to their humanity and wish to challenge the corporations are undoubtedly a threat. And, we see, obviously, in so many ways. I mean, if somebody happens to be on the corporate either neutralized, sort of being put in a role where they harm, paid off if they start to become uncomfortable with the activities of the corporation. And in being paid off, of course, they are required to sign a receipt and release and non-disclosure agreement to say that basically they take this money in return for keeping their mouth zipped. Well, there are, fortunately, an increasing number of people who are not prepared to take the money and are prepared to stand up for future generations. But all around the material world, there are different experiments going on as to how to neuter those who wish not to conform or subject themselves to the corporatist state. And this is done in a number of ways, and right from the very get-go. But today I'm just going to focus on what's occurring in Australia and indeed New Zealand, although the case I'm going to refer to is very much about Australia. But I know of a very similar case from 2006 in New Zealand, but I'll save that one for another time. But right now in Australia, a lady by the name of Fiona Wilson, who used to be on the payroll of Origin Energy. Now, Origin Energy is one of the companies that has been fracking the bejesus out of southern Queensland, and indeed one of the companies that was instrumental in driving George Bender to commit suicide some 2.5 years ago. Because the behavior of these companies is that they have the sanction to be able to do whatever it is they want to do and just ride roughshod over anybody who gets in their way. Well, this lady, Fiona Wilson, it would seem, became somewhat concerned about the activities of her employer and decided that she had to be able to live with her conscience, and started to push ahead with raising awareness of the dangers associated with this technology. Well, earlier this year, she was designated as a fixated threat. And this is the term used in Australia. And originally it was designed to prevent people in public life from stalkers. But it's the rules of engagement, if you like, have now been expanded so that anybody who has the audacity to speak out against the government agenda and who makes any kind of serious impact is at risk of being labelled as having a fixation on their cause, and therefore being a fixated threat. And under the fixated threat assessment process, they can then be sectioned. And Fiona Wilson was taken into protective custody against the will of herself and her family, and she was given a course of antipsychotic drugs. And she is now, although she's released, but she has to report back to the assessment centre and be dosed up so that basically she cannot pursue her fixated threat against the unconventional gas industry and against the politicians who are receiving significant chunks of funds from the unconventional gas industry. And therefore they neuter her. And of course, in doing so, what they are hoping to do is to scare the crap out of anybody else from speaking their mind, from challenging the industry. Now, this is in Australia. So don't think for 1 minute that ultimately the game plan isn't to implement this elsewhere. And, the English-speaking countries, the US, Canada, Australia, to a lesser extent these days, South Africa, and of course New Zealand. These countries are effectively all operating under a very similar legal process. And so, it shouldn't come as any great surprise to find that, when a law is introduced in one of these other countries, then ultimately and sometimes very quickly, it finds its way onto the statute books in the UK. And then, of course, in addition to that, we've got the European legislation to deal with. And it doesn't look like that's going away anytime soon, does it? So, I'm going to post some links and under this video. And I will download this and re-upload it onto Facebook, but it's only going out on YouTube today because Facebook do seem to have a problem with putting out my live stream videos in the morning, so we might have to get a little bit creative on that. But the importance really is, of course, to step beyond this, to make sure that the establishment and the corporatists know fine well that there's actually far too many of us to subjugate through fear. And that basically, if they pull stunts like this, it's actually going to have the unintended consequence of actually raising the alarm bells across an increasing percentage of the population. And I think that's where we're at right now. I think that people are seeing that the injunctions that are being sought by the likes of INEOS, UCOG, Quadrilla, of course, have now got theirs pending anyone taking it to trial. We've got the injunctions against the tree protesters in Sheffield, and we can expect to see the Sheffield-style injunction being rolled out elsewhere in the country. And another link that I'm going to post under here, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, is a short video from Bournemouth, where it's actually acknowledged in that video that it's not just trees and foliage that has a negative impact on the effectiveness of the 5G microwave signal, but also hanging baskets. So we can expect to see this kind of injunctive relief being increasingly sought by the corporations to be able to just simply ride roughshod over the wider populace. And the concrete jungles are going to become just that. They're going to become devoid of any foliage, because that would just get in the way of 5G. And in the rural areas, 5G is also going to be rolled out there. But of course, in the nearer term, then the threat of fracking is very, very significant. And as I mentioned yesterday, and as I have proven beyond any doubt whatsoever, not reasonable doubt, any doubt, the courts are hamstrung, thanks to a ruling in the High Court in 2012, from taking into account any evidence which proves that what the corporations are trying to do would have a very significant negative impact on the communities, on the environment, or on the ecology. The priority in the commercial courts is exactly that: commerce. And until such time as people really wake up to this and start to campaign and get in the faces of their elected representatives and make it clear that, all this BS about democratic process is just a charade, because ultimately it is the corporations that control what does and doesn't happen in this country, whilst leaving you to live under the illusion that you live in a democracy. And the corporations are happy to do that until such time as you challenge them. And then they're going to find a way to shut you down, either by threatening to take away your hard-earned resources, your physical resources, your property, or your liberty, or coming to a country near you, already in Australia, sectioning you and subjecting you to a course of medication to bring you back in line. I mean, this is 1984 on acid. Now, it's my opinion that when Eric Blair, George Orwell, wrote 1984, he was actually writing it as a warning against the risk of a right-wing, an extreme right-wing, corporate-driven, totalitarian state. And the reason I believe that is because some 15 years previously, a document by the name of Technocracy Inc. came into the public domain, written by King Hubbard, and it was the blueprint for the technocratic control grid. Now, back in 1932, of course, they didn't have the technology, they just had. Now they have technology, and what they don't have, getting very, very. And it is a crucial time in the history of humanity for so many reasons. I mean, we see humanity under assault from so many quarters here. And, obviously we have the artificial intelligence issue, we have the transhumanist issue, and we have the corporatist issue. And actually all of those are inextricably interlinked. And those who wish to try and dismiss this as simply conspiracy, well, you're not paying attention. And unfortunately, you are succumbing to the palliative that is thrown out to keep people dumbed down and just keep watching the football. Well, there's no need to watch it anymore, is there? So you might as well do something useful and do your own research and come to the realization that unless each and every one of us participates in some way in trying to recover the humanity within society, then the corporatist administration is simply going to ride roughshod, and we will be condemning future generations to lives of unimaginable, abject misery. And hopefully, also within the legal profession, just maybe, we may eventually trigger some humanity within the judges who sit in the corporate courts, because they can hide behind a single ruling and say, well, I can't even actually consider that evidence because of Samid versus the City of London back in 2012. Well, it needs judges to grow a set and say, you know what? Yes, I'm going to get it in the neck from the Lord Justices or the Lord Chancellor, but I have to do what I know to be right, and I have to make decisions based on the well-being of humanity and not the well-being of the corporations. So, as is always the case, don't take my word for anything. Do your own research. And thanks very much to Quadrilla for providing me with a lot more research here. And when the next company who are trying to frack elsewhere in the country, the next time they try and get an injunction, I'm even better prepared than I was this time. And we'll just keep chipping away until we get the desired result and humanity is back on track. Thanks for joining me this week. Thanks for all your support through this process. Unfortunately, not much of that really came from Lancashire, but that's an aside. There's a whole other story there, and I think more and more people are starting to take an interest in what is really going on in Lancashire. But meanwhile, you have a great weekend, and I will be back in my more usual locations in the outside next week. You have a great weekend. See you then. Bye now.